Okay, HadesOmega here. Welcome to the second part of the charger experiment for the my Sauron Light B experiment here, charging EVSE charging experiment here. Okay, so in the last video we charged it off my level 2 charger that's hooked up to my dryer circuit. That was a 220 volt charger. Now we're going to try to charge it from a 110 volt EVSE. Okay, so right here I got my Victory electric vehicle charge cable, okay? 120 volt charge cable. So here it has a standard, the NEMA, was it 515 connector, okay? There you go. This is the stock charger for my Victory Impulse, okay? And this is the one that works. You just plug it into a regular outlet, 110 volt outlet in America, and you should be able to use it, okay? So here we go. First thing to do, let's power up the EVSE. Got this extension cord right here. Okay, it's got power. Looks like it's good. No faults. Sometimes if you charge from if you charge with a really long extension cord, it might give you a fault. Okay, so but this I am charging with an extension cord. You're not really supposed to charge with an extension cord, but if you are using the extension cord, make sure you don't use one that's super duper long, and make sure that it's a heavy duty one. Okay, this one's a pretty heavy duty one. So, all right, so we're gonna go connect our EVSE adapter right here. Plug it in like so. Okay, connected. It says it's charging. All right, it's green, and then we're going to plug it in to the charger right here. Okay, green light, yellow light, fan turns on, red light. Okay, looks good so far. Now we're going to plug it into our battery. Ooh. Yeah, that made a big pop. Kind of scary. Okay. Okay. Green light, red light. Okay, there we go. Red light. Okay. So now I had my Shaoshang adapter connected from the last time. Okay. So as you can see, it works. It's only charging at 8.4 amps though. So I think this should be outputting 220 volts. That's what I'm thinking. I think it's working. See how hot everything gets. It looks fine. So I'm not really sure how a 110 volt EVSE works, or 120 volt it says here works, like how it should. Ooh, I smell something burning. Okay, so before I even plugged it in, I should have checked how much voltage is coming out of that adapter. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and plug this in again. Alright, I got a multimeter, so we're going to go ahead and check that. I didn't get any kind of charging fault though, so I have this set at AC, on AC. I think the ground is right here, right? Okay, ooh, it's 120 volts. Okay, so yeah, that's why it wasn't running so hot. So, so there's the results of our experiment. So it says 120 volts right there. Okay, so it's outputting 120 volts. We can get this thing to freaking stay. Okay, there we go. So it's 120 volts. you guys can see in the camera, 120 volts. Okay, so we weren't supposed to hook this up. Okay, so that's the results of the experiment. Well, it actually worked. It actually worked for a little while. It worked at 8 amps. So, but I started smelling a burning smell. So I said like, oh, disconnect it right away. So when you connect it to a 120 volt EVSE, you're only going to get 120 volts out of the plug. So your charger, I guess the charger on board the cars and stuff, like on the motorcycle, it's designed to operate at 2 different voltages, the 120 volts and the 220 volts, okay? So if you're using a level 1 EVSE, one that's just plugged into a 120 volt outlet, you're only going to get 120 volts out of this bad boy. Okay, so I wasn't supposed to connect that in there, but it did work. So that's the interesting thing. For a little while, it did charge at like 8 amps though. It didn't charge it to full. So HadesOmega, before HadesOmega plugged this in, we should have checked the voltage on this plug first. Okay, so I didn't. And I did, and it was 120 volts. I'm like, oh, we shouldn't have plugged this in because this is a 220 volt charger. Okay, so hopefully we didn't mess the charger up. It seemed like it was working fine though. So that's kind of odd because they said it only worked at 220 volts. So HadesOmega could have bricked his charger. Okay, so that's a kind of like a failed experiment. Well, it's not a failed experiment. That's the results of the experiment right there. Okay, to see if we could charge the bike using a level 1 charger, basically a 120 volt charger, or 120 volt EVSE, and no, it doesn't. You shouldn't do it. Okay, so that's a no-go. Don't do that. You've got to charge it from one plugged into a 220 volt outlet. So whatever your EVSE is plugged into, whatever outlet is plugged into, that's the power you're going to get, okay? But a public charging station should operate at 220 volts, okay? So this is 120 volts, so we shouldn't have used this charger. We should have used 100. You know what? You know what we can do? We can actually use this charger. Yeah, okay, so we can actually test it with this. Okay, this is a 120 volt charger right here. So another little experiment, a bonus, is we're going to plug this guy into here. Okay, turn it on. It should work just fine. Okay. Plug it into here. Okay, it's charging at 5 amps. So there you go. So that's a 110 volt charger. Okay. Zoom in a little bit here for you guys. There you go. So it's charging at 5 amps right now. Let's double check that. Okay, there it is. It's charging at about 5 amps. Okay. So if we turn it up, should be able to do about 10 amps. It only does like 8 amps. Oh yeah, it'll do 10. It'll do 12. Okay, yeah. So yeah, it'll charge at 10 amps. So there you go. So if you have so now what we found out is if you have a 110 volt charger, you can use a 110 volt EVSE. Okay. Okay, yeah, so if you have a 10 volt 72 volt charger, okay, you can use it with a 120 volt EVSE. Ideally, if you can get a charger that can charge at dual voltages like 110 or 220, then it should be fine. Okay, so just trying to monitor how hot one of these cables are going here. Wait, I guess we don't. Anyway, I'm gonna turn it down now. Okay, yeah. So so that concludes our second experiment here. If you plug into 120 volt EVSE, you're only gonna get 120 volts out of it. Okay, so and then your charger is the one that adapts the voltage. Okay, so this does not work at dual voltages. These do not work at dual voltages. That's why I have to have 2 chargers. Okay, so this is what I'm going to use for 110 volts, and this is what I'm going to use for 220 volts. Okay, So that's how it is. Unfortunately, it can't do both voltages. It's just kind of funky, but alright, so hopefully we didn't damage this one by plugging it into 120 volts. It seemed to be working fine. It was just charging at like 8 amps. So, but yeah. So just remember that. Just remember that if you're using HadesOmega didn't know that. So and then what we should have done is we should have checked the voltage before we plugged it in. Okay, so but it did work. So I'm surprised. I'm surprised it didn't just blow up. But yeah, if you're definitely if you're using 100, like let's say we plug this into the 220 volts, this might explode, okay? Because it was designed to operate at 120 volts. That double voltage will probably blow it up, okay? Now if you do it opposite, it's not so bad, you know. You're like basically cutting the voltage in half, so it's just not gonna run like how it's supposed to run, but it won't like explode or anything, you know. Hopefully not. That's what HadesOmega has learned from plugging computers in overseas. I'm not gonna lie. There's a little switch on the back of the computer on the power supply. You're supposed to switch it to 220 before you plug a 220 in, and HadesOmega forgot to do that a couple times, and like yeah, smoke and all that stuff happened. So, all right. Hopefully we didn't damage this. I will go plug it into the 220 volts again and see how it is. So, all right. So that's the end of our experiment. If you're using a 110 or 120 volt EVSE, you've got to have a 110, 120 volt dealie, okay? So it's public charging stations are supposed to only operate at 220 volts. So I think if you're charging at a public charging station, you should be fine, okay? But if you're going to be using a 120 volt EVSE like this one here, that's made to plug into only 120 volts, you're only going to get 120 volts, so you better have a charger that does 120 volts, okay? This one does 220, so we shouldn't use this one, okay? So HadesOmega kind of messed up, but that's the results of the experiment. So don't do it. Make sure the EVSE that you plug in is compatible with the charger that you're using, okay? Or you have like a dual voltage kind of charger and stuff. Okay, so that's what we learned from the second experiment. For the next experiment, we will be going to a public charger, and we will be actually going to field test this out. Okay, so look forward to that in the future. All right, HadesOmega out. All right, sorry, HadesOmega is not a freaking electrician. Okay, I work more with I know more about like direct current than alternating current. Okay, so this is what HadesOmega has learned. Okay, is I have the 120 volts plugged in right now. If you plug in the 120 volts, okay, you'll get 120 volts from one of the plugs, okay? But if you go to the other one, you get 0 volts, okay? So that's how you know you have 120 volt dealie, okay? Hopefully you guys can read all this. But okay, so if you connect the ground and you plug into one of the receptacles, one of the prongs, it should be 120 volts. It's 123 or something, okay? If you plug it to the other one, if you connect that, you get nothing, okay? That's if you have 120 volts, so that's where your 120 volts comes from, okay? So one of these doesn't do anything. There's no voltage in it. Okay? So that's how you know you have 120 volts, if one is 0 and one is 120, okay? Now, I'm going to go and plug this. Okay? Get that out of the way. We're going to plug our 220 in, okay? 220. Okay? So, check that. Okay, we got our 120 volts again. Okay, I gotta move it to the other receptacle. And you should get another 120 volts. So 120 plus 120 is 220. So if both of these have voltage, that means you got 220 volts, okay? If one of them has 120 volts and the other one has no voltage, then you have 120 volts, okay? And that's how you know that. Alright? And then so this should just work. Okay. And it should output again. So I have the 220 volts plugged in right now. I'll let you know. You can see the light on the chart. There we go. So it's blinking now. There should be charge. It should output close to 10 amps, and it is. Okay. So it's a good thing we didn't mess it up when you plugged it into the 120 volt outlet. Okay. So, all right. So, so that's the end of the experiment. If you plug into 120 volt EVSE, you should get 120 volts coming out of the adapter. Okay, there should be one of the plugs should be one is the ground, one should be 120 volts, and the other should be 0 volts. Okay, now if you have a 220 plugged in, one of the you have the black connected to the ground, and if you get 120 volts out of both prongs or receptacles, you have 220 volts. Okay, so you just add them. So, all right. So HadesOmega didn't know that, and now he does. So, and now you guys know. So that's how that works. When you have 120 volts EVSE in, it only outputs 120 volts. If you have a 220 volt EVSE, so just remember that. Okay, so you can't plug this in to this, because this is 120 volts. I started smelling some stuff smoking and stuff. Hopefully we didn't mess it up too bad. But it seems to be working fine now. So yeah. And then if you have it hooked up to a 220, it'll output 220. Public charging stations are supposed to operate at 220. Okay, so for all public charging stations, but if you use 120 volts, it outputs 120. So that was the experiment. Don't do it. You can do it if you have a charger rated for 120 volts, okay? Like this one here. This one is rated for 120 volts. So you could use this with that EVSE, okay? So if for whatever reason, let's say you're traveling and let's say there's a garage that has an EVSE that's hooked up to a 110, you can bring your 110 charger with you and charge with it, okay? But if they have a level 2 that's hooked up to a 220 like my dryer outlet, that'll be 220 volts. You're going to want to connect it to your 220 volt charger, okay? So that's one thing to know. So don't mix up the voltages, okay? Unless you have a charger that's capable of doing that. But you just saw it actually worked. It actually worked. I was like, whoa, okay. I'm surprised it like, you know, something might have overheated or something, but it seems fine. So. All right, so that's the end of the second part of the experimental EVSE for the Sauron Light B and the Lightspeed battery. So make sure if you're using an EVSE plugged in to a 120 volt outlet, you have it plugged in with this EVSE adapter. Make sure you have a 110 volt, 120 volt charger, okay? And if you have it plugged into a 220 or a public charging station, we'll find that out. Maybe I'll take a voltmeter with me, you know, and check. Yeah, that's actually a good idea. We should do that. You should use a 220 volt charger, okay? Like this one right here. Alright, I hope you guys learned something, as I just did. I learned how to check voltages from the receptacle and how to check if it's 120 or 220. Alright, alright, let's figure out.